Okay, welcome to the Employee Ownership, a Strategy for Business Resiliency and Succession webinar. I'm CJ Seitz, the Director of Western Washington Small Business Development Center, where we offer confidential business advising on starting, growing, and transitioning your business, all at no charge, thanks to the wonderful community support we have. We have a terrific lineup of speakers for you today. Before we get started, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. We will be recording today's session and we'll share it back with you in a few days and with a note of thanks. Everyone besides the speakers will be muted, but please feel free to add your questions to the chat box during the webinar. We have set aside some time at the end of the webinar for a rich dialogue where we will be able to answer questions. So next slide, please. This slide showcases some wonderful Washington companies, great brands that you may be familiar with. These are all examples of successful employee-owned firms. Locally owned and operated firms are engines of community vitality. During this time of unparalleled change, preserving local business is critically important. There are so many benefits to employee-owned companies, but one of the most essential is keeping our anchor businesses here locally and retaining quality jobs. Not to mention passing down the joy of small business ownership to the next generation. Next slide, please. We are thrilled to have this great lineup of speakers here with us today to share their expertise. A warm welcome to all. Here joining us today is Allison Legane, the co-founder of Project Equity, Annie Quammen, Director of Human Resources for Superfeet, Jeff Stodola, President, Excel Pacific, and last but not least, Mitch Miller, Senior Consultant for the Beister Institute. Welcome, everybody. We're going to kick it off with Allison.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Allison Legane, co-founder of Project Equity, and we are a national nonprofit focused on helping make employee ownership a much more normal thing for businesses because of its many benefits. As an organization, we do a lot of work to raise awareness of employee ownership through webinars like this one, and through partnerships with organizations like the Whatcom Community Foundation, the Beister Institute, the Western Washington University SBDC, who've come together to work towards setting up a state employee ownership center to serve all of Washington and to help, of course, SBDC clients learn about and consider employee ownership. In addition to that, at Project Equity, we work hands-on with business owners to make the transition a reality. Next slide, please. When we talk about employee ownership, we mean broad-based ownership as compared with, say, stock options or management buyout. What we refer to is when all employees who meet basic criteria, so that could mean a minimum number of hours or having been with the business for a certain time period, have the opportunity to become employee owners. Employee ownership provides value to three really important constituencies. First, the community broadly by retaining jobs and businesses by keeping companies rooted in place into the next generation. Second, to the businesses by creating more resilient companies that outperform their peers. And third, to the employees themselves by creating high quality jobs that include building up ownership of an asset, the asset being the business where they work. Next slide. Here's the agenda for our presentation today. And I'm just going to kick us off by talking about what we call the twin small business crises. Next, and one more next. Next slide. So perfect. Pre-pandemic, we already had a small business crisis given what's called the silver tsunami of retiring baby boomers. COVID has, of course, put tremendous stress on businesses, especially in certain sectors. And we know that when local companies go out of business or when they're sold to out-of-area buyers, it can really affect that local economic vitality. And rural communities are especially hard hit when longstanding businesses are lost. So this needed focus on preserving Washington small businesses and jobs is what we're talking about today through the strategy of employee ownership. Next slide. This great wave of retiring business owners, the silver tsunami, it's estimated that 1 out of every 2 local job creators, so these are privately held small businesses with employees, are owned by baby boomers. The baby boomer generation is aged 55 to 74 today, so the impact of their retirement is already being felt, but it is long from over, especially since most business owners don't retire from their companies at age 65. It's more like 75. sometimes even older. Next slide. In 2019, the Whatcom Community Foundation commissioned an analysis of the silver tsunami impact in Washington that Project Equity developed. It was funded in partnership with 4 other community foundations from across the state, and it underscored truly the need for succession planning among Washington businesses and the potential impact if we didn't have these businesses continue on. Nearly 60,000 businesses in the state of Washington are estimated to be owned by baby boomers, employing nearly 600,000 workers. That's a really big deal. Next slide. With so many businesses needing to change hands, we have a lot of sellers and few buyers. So businesses listed for sale sell at a low rate. And kids are not taking over their parents' businesses these days. Only about 15% transition into the second generation. What employee ownership brings is that it helps business owners find a buyer right under their nose. Next slide. For the business owners for those of you on the call today who are business owners, as you think about what your succession or exit options are, we want to ask you to do a quick thought experiment. Imagine that you're sitting in the future 5 years after having sold your business, looking back at your company in 5 years. What do you want to see? Do you want to see that you have preserved the legacy of your life's work, that you've made a market value sale, that you've optimized the tax situation for yourself and for your business, and that you've retained your employees and preserved your jobs? We're working right now with an 80-year-old business owner who, when the pandemic first hit, he could have just closed up shop. He was in a financial position that he didn't need the sale of the business for his retirement. But he could not stomach leaving his 40 employees in the lurch, as more than half of them had been by his side for over 15 years. He shared that he just couldn't do that to them, and could we please help him? And so we're now supporting his transition to employee ownership. Next slide, please. A quick story from one of our clients. This is Cal Solar, 100% employee-owned solar design and installation company. They're about 30 people, and early in the shelter in place, they made the decision to furlough the employees so they could tap unemployment. Now, well furloughed, this group of employees still came together to try and figure out how to keep the business earning revenue, and so how to make sure they had jobs to come back to. They came up with an idea to become a battery reseller for storing electricity produced by the solar panels. And they were able to create a whole new line of business that ended up making up from all of the lost revenue caused by the overall disruption of COVID. Would furloughed employees in a non-employee-owned company have shown this proactive ingenuity? It's all because of the employee engagement that ownership brings. Next slide. High employee engagement results in employee-owned businesses outperforming their peers. I've pulled a couple of stats here. On the left, we've got from the Democracy at Work Institute, 8.5% higher profit margin than industry peers. And on the right, a study from the National Center for Employee Ownership showing sales and employment growing 2% faster year after year after year. Next slide, please. The Employee Ownership Foundation completed a study right in the midst of the pandemic about mid-year, and they compared traditionally owned companies. They found that employee-owned companies compared to the traditionally owned companies retain jobs at a 4-to-1 rate. They also were less than half as likely to cut employees' pay. And in that time period, mid-2020, they were 6 times more likely to say that they expected to make a full recovery after the pandemic. This is the kind of local economic resiliency that we want. Okay, enough data and stats. Let's move to the real deal. So now I want to invite Annie and Jeff to come back on video and make sure you're unmuted so that we can have a conversation with you both about Superfeed and Excel Pacific. So thank you again to you both for joining us today to help tell the story of your company's experience with employee ownership. We're going to leave this slide up so all of our guests can read a bit more about your companies while we have a conversation. So I'm going to kick off just with an opening question for each of you to help you introduce yourself and your business to everyone who's joined us. So Annie, why don't we start with you and have you tell us about Superfeet, who you are, how your company became employee owned, what was the motivation, how did it come about?
Sure, thanks for having me, everybody. It's nice to be here. Let's see, Superfeet, I think we're best known for being an insole company. If you've been in REI or a similar store and seen those bright boxes of green, this color green, blue, orangeberry insoles, that's us. We started in 1977, as this slide shows. And then starting about 2005, our founders started having the conversation about what's our exit strategy. And our company has long been founded on the notions of doing the right thing and not being greedy. And with those two thoughts in mind, it was a really easy transition into the conversations about becoming an ESOP, which we became in 2006. So the thought was, if the company sells, everybody here has made us as great as we are, and so everybody should get to benefit in that, not just a few. So it's that broadband ownership that Allison was talking about at the beginning. And then in 2015 is when we became 100% employee owned. So that's only been just maybe 6 years for us, which has been something we celebrate all the time, and I think we'll talk about later, but there's some great tax benefits to being 100% employee owned. Yeah, Allison, I'm not sure, I think I just rambled, but I'm not sure if I answered all that, touched on all the points.
Great. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks. Jeff, same question for you. Tell us a bit about who is XL Pacific and how you became employee owned, the motivation, how it came about.
You bet. Well, thanks again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about employee ownership. It means a lot to us as a company. We were founded in 1989, and we're a general contractor. We perform work throughout the Pacific Northwest and mostly focus in the Bellingham, sort of North County area and then down through Seattle, but a lot of work throughout Washington State and other states on the West Coast. Our ownership group and founders really started this company focused on employees from the beginning. And I think that as we've grown, the value of employees to the company, what they bring to us, and the longevity of them being part of that has just always been a focus of ours. And so about 7 years ago, we really started to focus in on knowing that it was time to develop a succession plan for the company, and started just asking around, doing a lot of research on different options that we had. And we always knew we wanted to be an enduring organization that lasted and lived beyond us. And you know, our legacy goals really were focused on our people. And so as we continued the research, the core values that we have as a company and our culture, with that focus on our people, really pointed, you know, squarely in the direction of employee ownership. And so in 2017 is when we went to an ESOP, and we went 100% ownership from the very beginning. And it was a pretty aggressive move for us, but we felt like it was the right thing to do for all of our people. We have a lot of people that have been with us for a long time, several from the very beginning still, and I'd say 50% of our employees have been here more than 10 years. So putting the focus on the people has been key for us.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear both of your stories. Jeff, let's stick with you for just a minute. So now that you are, you know, as 4 years or so been employee owned, you know, you talked about how the employees and really defined the company from the beginning. But are there any ways that employee ownership itself today helps define who you are as a company, or are there ways that employee ownership makes your company stronger today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mentioned kind of our core values and our culture, and interestingly, around the same time that we made the decision to go to ESOP, we were putting a lot of time into really clarifying, defining our vision and who we were. And sort of our top, I would say our top 2 or 3 core values. The first being a company that's dedicated to shared success. The second, providing opportunities for a fulfilled life. And the third is we take care of each other like family. We have a few others, but those 3 we refer to a lot as we do business. And I think that being an ESOP and being able to communicate those and then tie that together with ownership, it makes us very strong together as a company. We also, leading up to going to ESOP, we put a lot of time into making the commitment when we can to that when we hire, we want to hire for people to retire here. And we would say that often in our interviews, you know, that we want you to, if we choose you and you choose us, we want you to be here till you retire. And so we had put a lot of time into making sure that we really emphasized in our 401k matches that we like people thinking long-term financially. And I think the ESOP emphasizes that exact point. And so the long-term saving concept and retirement with us as their chosen company, I think that also is exactly what, you know, epitomizes us as a company. So I'd say those are a couple of examples that kind of, you know, I guess give, you know, show how our vision is tied to who we are as an ESOP as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Really, the specific examples really brings it to life. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
So Annie, sort of a similar question. You know, what's this like at Superfeet? How does employee ownership define who Superfeet is today, and how does it make you as a company stronger?
I think a lot of similar ways to what Jeff was talking about, but we are really proud to be employee owned. So we talk about it a lot, and you see it show up in small ways and big ways. Small ways might just be some of the decisions we're making on our expenses, and is that the best way to be spending our collective money, where maybe some more traditional companies I've worked with in the past, when you see someone traveling for the company, they're trying to have the expensive dinner and the expensive hotel because they know they can expense it. But when it's your own company and your own money, you're making different decisions. You're treating things differently, like you own it because you do. So I think those are some of the really small things, but you see it show up in big ways as well, like when we're choosing who we're going to partner with. The same as Jeff's talking about when you're talking about recruiting and who you're bringing on board. They're not just an employee, they're a business partner of yours, and you're hoping for this long-term relationship. So you're just looking at things in a different way. And similar to, I think Cal Solar was the example you used, Allison, when COVID started. Superfeet had a similar experience. We sell insoles into retail. Retail was closed. So come April of last year, everywhere we sold was closed. We sell on Amazon. They were only selling, I think, like toilet paper and hand sanitizer at the time. So they weren't buying for us either. And so instead of panicking, our employees got together and have this entrepreneurial spirit and innovative mind, and just said, how can we help? And so we started manufacturing PPE for the medical community, which has absolutely nothing to do with our business, but it goes back to those ethos and similar to what Jeff talks about, those core values that are really part of your business, not just some, you know, image posted on your wall or on the mouse pad you pass out, but really truly who you are, about not being greedy, you know, helping each other out, that community spirit, and maybe more of an us thought than just like a me thought. And we saw some really amazing things come from it for our business, for the community, kept all of our people working. And so I'm not sure that would have happened had we been a different kind of company. So it's a nice example to share, I think.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful story. Thanks for sharing that. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges? You know, certainly there's no situation that's all roses all the time. What are some of the challenges of employee ownership? How do those challenges surface maybe differently because you're employee owned?
Yeah, I think there can be, if you're not careful, there can be some confusion about what it means to be an employee owner. So do you still have a traditional structure in your organization, or does everyone, think they get to have a say in everything and be privy to confidential information? Where are those boundaries? So I think it can be challenging if you're not clear about those from the beginning, if you're not clear about those for yourself, and then if you're not clear in your communication. I think that can be a challenge. And then there are compliance things. It's governed under the ERISA rules, and so there's audits and filings and things you want to be really careful you're getting right, just similar to your 401k, but there's extra work in that way. Those are, I think, some of the two big ones I would think of.
Great. Yeah, Jeff, what do you have to add to that? What's experience like on your end?
As far as challenges, yeah, I think that it's real similar. One thing that we found, as Annie mentioned, I think it's important to really be clear. At least for us, we tried to be very clear from the beginning that from a management standpoint of how the company is managed day to day, that nothing was changing. That we all have our responsibilities in this company, and that's what we're all hired for, and so we weren't changing that, but we were certainly looking for a high level of engagement from each position. And so I think occasionally, there can be a little bit of a fine line between ideas that people think are the best for the company and thinking that they should be able to speak for the company almost on some of those. And so we don't run into it very often, but it is something that's important to communicate. I think one other potential challenge that's real that I think people need to think about is it's a real different mindset of being a group. In our case, we have 200 employees. So you have 200 owners essentially. And when you make that transition and move from, say, a small group of owners to a large group of owners, there always are going to be some folks that maybe were the high performers or top management folks that kind of wonder, hey, now I'm just the same as everybody else, and it's sort of there's a little bit of a recognition of a loss of entrepreneurial spirit there, where perhaps they had a vision of being in a small group of ownership. And so you need to work on that, and there are options, management incentive plans in that you can set up within the ESOP, in our case, that can really motivate those individuals. And so we've had to work hard at that, and I think that's important to point out. One other thing is it does take a little time as you get started for the value of the stock to grow. And so being a good communicator of that and trying to set expectations is really important, that it's not going to just suddenly skyrocket off the charts in the first few years as you're paying down some of the seller debt that you need to get through at the beginning.
Can I jump in, Allison, out of turn here?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really good point that Jeff made, and I want to piggyback off of it, is once your stock does take off, are you being really mindful as an organization? Can you fund that? So when people leave your organization and you have to start paying them out, are you prepared for that? And so when your stock grows high, you want to get ahead of that and make sure you've got a plan, so you're not caught and blindsided by that financial need.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, really great insights for people who are considering employee ownership, so that they can go into this with their eyes open. With the two of you in sitting in different seats in the organization, would love to just have you spend a minute. So from your role, Annie, let's have you start from your role sitting in HR. What is it about how your role interacts with employee ownership? And then Jeff will ask you the same question.
Yeah, my role interacts with employee ownership every day. I mean, we're always talking about it, so it seems like any interaction could possibly weave that into the conversation. But for me, recruiting is easier. I mean, it's really attractive. It's not super common to be an ESOP, so when they hear you're employee owned, they want to know more about what that means. So it's an attractive thing to at least get people to your door. Whether or not that's the right person for you, you'll decide in the interview, but it helps. It helps. Retention, turnover. It can be interesting. Some of the younger generations, and likely it's just because you're younger and you're not thinking about retirement, but they don't always see the benefit of an ESOP the way maybe someone 15 years older than them might. So there's a lot of challenges for communication and trying to get people to see that long-term investment strategy that Jeff was talking about too, is see how valuable it really could be to them. So there's a lot of education in my role. And then I do all of the compliance pieces as well, which is working with our TPA and auditors to do the audits, to work with our finance team who's working with an outside valuation company on the valuation, and then doing all the allocations and then processing distributions if and when it's time for that. So I think those are the big buckets for me.
Great. And how about Jeff, from your role as president?
Yeah, I would echo what Annie said. I mean, in many ways, you're just very engaged all the time. Yeah, I think the topic comes up a lot of what ownership means. So in many ways, I guess I see myself as a cheerleader for the company for what ESOP is, and just continuing to encourage it and pass that on. Obviously, I'm involved a lot in corporate profitability goals, and you know, for us, a significant change is being more transparent about how we're doing from a profitability standpoint, and really getting buy-in and engagement in that. And so that's one of my jobs, is making sure that I can clearly identify to people what our goals are, and I communicate that pretty regularly. And then we talk about how are we doing? What are the things that are helping, and what are the things that are hurting us hit targets that we have? So I really actually enjoy that, to make it a little bit more transparent so that people can engage more in it. Again, as Annie said, the valuation process, our CFO spends the majority of the time on that, but I definitely get involved, and we get interviewed every year as to how we're doing, and so that takes up some of my time, and is very important every year to do. And then there's fun things. We talked a little bit about just getting participation, and so we are always creatively trying to think of ways to get people engaged. And I think that, you know, we have an ESOP month in September every year. So throughout that month, we're doing all kinds of events and things just to get people more engaged. We had a Shark Tank competition, which was just a complete blast. And hey, we came up with all kinds of great ideas and several things that we've implemented, and people have felt really empowered there to come up with ideas that we can add. So those are just a few of the examples of the way that I personally get involved. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, and you know, you're always looking to encourage and see others that kind of take the baton as well, and start passing that on. And those are some of the best days, when you hear others just talking about how great it is, and sharing that with newer employees. It's great to see that.
Wonderful. This has been fantastic. Thank you to the both of you for sharing a bit more about what employee ownership looks like, and super inspiring. So we're going to switch gears now and get into maybe more of the dry part of it, the nuts and bolts of how employee ownership works. So yeah, you guys can pop off video if you want, or stay on.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so nuts and bolts. How does this work? What is an employee ownership transition? So at the highest, kind of most conceptual level, it is the sale of a business or its assets or its stock to a new entity with employee owners. It can be done in stages, as we heard about from Superfeet, or all at once, as Excel Pacific did it. And the purchase can be financed by a loan taken out by the company and repaid over time through future profits. Management typically stays the same. Sometimes employee owners have governance roles, either by electing or serving on the board of directors, so at a very high level. Okay, next slide, please. So some of the benefits that we've heard about. One, owners can achieve a fair sale price. Usually the business is the owner's retirement nest egg, so this is critically important. Second, the owners retain influence on pacing and exit timeline. Is it phased? Are you doing a partial sale now, or 100% in 5 years? How does as the founder maybe, how does my operational exit time with this transition? It doesn't have to be done at the same time. It can be done separately. And of course, preserving the company's legacy, culture, people, and assets, as we've talked about, versus potentially having the business dismantled through a sale. Next slide. How do I know if my company could be a fit? Businesses with strong track record of profitability, at least pre-COVID, with enough employees. So there's any company size can be great unless you're too small. So fewer than 10 employees is typically not going to be a good fit for employee ownership. And the size can vary depending on the model. We'll get to that in a second. And then just established and stable in terms of the business. Next slide, please. The three most common forms of employee ownership are ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, worker cooperatives, and employee ownership trusts. ESOPs are the most common of those in the United States, and I'm going to share a brief overview of all three on the next slides, and then we're going to get a bit of a deeper dive into ESOPs from our partner Mitch Miller at the Beister Institute in just a minute. Okay, so next slide, ESOPs. These are best fit for companies with larger workforces, so floor of about 40 employees and about 2 million or more in revenue. The reason for this is because the federal government has provided significant tax benefits to encourage employee ownership through ESOPs because they believe in all of the benefits we've been talking about today. But they don't give away tax benefits without putting regulation in place to make sure that everybody's following the rules. So that regulation has some increased costs. You heard a little bit about that from our two speakers that make ESOP a bit more expensive, both to set up and on an ongoing basis. But the takeaway should be that those increased costs are more than offset by the tax benefits for companies over this minimum size threshold. ESOPs are qualified retirement plans like a 401k, so employee ownership is a benefit to the employees, not at no cost to them. The shares sit in a trust administered on behalf of the employees. Okay, so that's ESOPs. The next slide, we'll look at worker-owned cooperatives. Now, these are a fit for just about any size businesses with that same floor of 10 or more employees. There are worker co-ops with thousands of employees, so they can go all the way up to any size. Worker cooperatives are far less complex in their structure than ESOPs are, so they're lower cost to set up and lower ongoing costs, and they provide a direct role in governance, with employee owners electing and making up the majority of the board of directors. Employees pay a small buy-in to receive their single voting share of stock. This buy-in is usually something like a few $100s or $1,000, a couple $1,000s. The goal is to make it some financial skin in the game, but not out of reach for the lowest paid employees, so that everybody can access ownership. Okay, so that's a worker-owned co-op. And the third main form, next slide, is an employee ownership trust. These are less common in the United States, but growing in the US and very, very widely used in parts of Europe, especially in the UK. They're a trust structure like an ESOP is, but they don't come with the same tax benefits. But what they do offer is a lot of customization. It's a very, very flexible form, especially if an ESOP isn't a fit or a worker co-op isn't a fit for various reasons. They're perpetual in nature. So some people are attracted to ESOPs because they want to make sure their company remains employee-owned. Attracted to a trust, be it the perpetual trust or employee ownership trust, because they want to make sure their company remains employee-owned for the long term. And similar to an ESOP, there's not any formal or informal employee engagement baked into the model, but those decision-making or governance roles can be designed in and layered on top. Okay, so those are the three main forms. We're going to get a bit more about ESOPs in a minute, but next slide. Just to reiterate, employee ownership can be used to sell all or part of the business, and the way it works is the business takes out a loan. This is a really, really important distinction from most other forms of selling a company. The employees themselves do not take out the loan, nor do the employees have to have rich uncles. The business, based upon its history of operations and positive cash flow, is the one that holds the loan, which is then paid off over time through future profits. Next slide. So what this does is it gets the business owner some liquidity right up front. There's typically a seller note alongside a bank or other financing. So if, for example, it's a 30% seller note, the owner would get 70% liquidity on the day of the sale, excuse me, and the remainder of that liquidity over time through payment of that seller note, say 5 years, 7 years. And as I mentioned previously, the only form that has employee owners putting up some of their own money is a worker co-op, and it's a very nominal amount of equity compared to the sale price. At close, it's usually between 0 and 5%. Okay, so now as promised, we're going to go do a bit of a deeper dive into ESOP. So we'll invite Mitch Miller from the Beister Institute to walk us through that.
Hello. I don't know. Do I need to turn on my? Here we go.
Yeah, we'll get you on screen.
And next slide, please. Yeah. So, all right. Maybe I'll take just a quick minute to introduce myself and the Beister Institute. You may see from our logo, we're located at UC San Diego at the Rady School of Management. We're a center of excellence, and by being a part of a university, we're nonprofit in nature. So our mission is to provide education to on primarily ESOPs, but broad-based employee ownership to business owners, to existing ESOP companies. So we offer consulting services to business owners that want to take a look at ESOPs. We also provide educational programs, so short courses. For these range from webinars to multi-day programs with faculty from across the nation. And those programs are geared towards companies that have ESOPs, as well as ESOP professionals that can learn more about ESOPs. So I wanted to take a minute with you all today to speak about the particulars. The ESOPs are complex, but with the use of some professionals out there, the complexity is offloaded onto those professionals, and hopefully you're led through the process. So an ESOP is a trust by nature. Here, a trust typically has three components. There's a trustee, there's property, and there are beneficiaries. And this is in any trust. They're all governed by the trust document. So it's an agreement between people with respect to property. Now, in the ESOP, the trust is a tax-qualified trust that is a retirement plan, meaning it abides by the rules under ERISA. Employee Retirement Income Security Act was passed in 1974, so it's been around a long time. The property is the company stock, and then the beneficiaries are the employees. So the trustee holds the company stock for the benefit of the employees. Next slide, please. So here we have a pretty complex slide. Hopefully I can distill it into a couple simple steps. This transaction is for $4 million, and we're transferring 100% ownership of OpCo. The idea is that we go out and borrow money from usually a combination of a senior lender like a bank or the sellers, the selling shareholders. Now, OpCo has, in this case, borrowed $1 million from the bank and $3 million from the sellers. Now, OpCo gives that money to the ESOP trust in exchange for what you call the inside loan. The inside loan is a lot longer term than the outside loans between the bank and the seller. This is a favorable loan. You don't want to, the company doesn't want to earn money off of the ESOP trust, so we have a really low interest rate. And that controls the benefit level. I'll explain that on the next slide. So now the ESOP has $4 million. Oh, sorry, could you go, almost there. Yeah, thanks. Now the ESOP has $4 million, and buys the shares from the shareholder using that money. And sometimes that diagonal line, what we'll do is exchange notes around, and different parties are selling to different parties. The transaction structuring of this is a little complex. There's tax code involved, and that's why it's pretty necessary to work with someone who knows what they're doing. It's probably a bad idea to work with an advisor that said they've done 1 or 2 ESOPs. They should be well versed in this area. The consequences are really big. So the next slide. So now another complex one, but the ideas are simple. So we need to repay the 2 loans we've created. So OPCO, on the outside loans, uses profits. First, it pays off the senior note. So we have $1 million paid off to the bank. And then during that time, it's interest only to the sellers, which are subordinated notes. Once the senior note is paid off, then it begins the principal payments on the subordinated note. It's also common to refinance the subordinated note once the senior note is paid off, and then you get the selling shareholders cash out at that time. Now, switching attention to the inside loan. So here we recall we had a loan of $4 million between OPCO and the trust. Well, in this example, it's a 20-year inside loan, and every year the ESOP needs to pay the company $200,000. Let's forget about interest for the time being. But the ESOP doesn't generate money, so where does it get the money? The company contributes cash to the ESOP every year in the form of a pre-tax retirement benefit. That's a business expense, and that's just one of the tax benefits that we generate here. So that's pre-tax money going into the ESOP. Now the ESOP returns that money in the form of a loan payment, and loan payment is not reported as income, so it's not taxed. So year over year now we have $200,000 of money that's been, and the joke is this is legal money laundering. Again, it's been happening since the 70s, and the IRS and Department of Labor are all very familiar with this. There's no issues, so don't be alarmed that there's a problem here. No, this is actually what was intended by Congress when it was passed, that the employee, well, in this case, OPCO, the ESOP company, gets a tax break for selling to its employees, or having this employee ownership program. And then as that inside loan is paid off, the bottom 3 arrows are, the benefits are allocated year over year. So if the inside loan is 20 years, roughly 1/20th of the shares will be released to employee accounts year over year as that inside loan is paid off. So that's the benefit level to the employees. And before, I have here in the middle, tax strategies reduce income and allow more cash flow. I didn't really have a slide prepared on tax. There's a lot to talk about, and I have very little time. We have 2 100% ESOP-owned companies on this program today. And the huge benefit to reaching that level is that if you're an S corporation, you're not going to pay tax. So yeah, it's amazing to consider that in America, you can operate a for-profit company without paying income tax. The way it works is the tax is passed through the company to the shareholder. And in this case, the shareholder is a tax qualified trust. So by definition, it doesn't pay tax. And that's the end of the story. The business didn't have to pay out any money to cover the shareholders' taxes. There's no corporate tax being paid. So all that money that's left in the company from what they would have otherwise paid in taxes gets to be paid to grow the company, or it gets paid out in employee benefits. And it's kind of a funny problem right now. We see a lot of S corporation ESOP companies that have too much cash on the books, and they have to figure out how to use the cash. It's a great problem to have. So next slide, please. We've talked a bit about governance, so I can kind of skim through this, but it's important to note that once you have an ESOP company, you operate it's just the same as any other corporation. Really, the only difference is that the owner is a prudent owner, which is the ESOP trustee. So the ESOP trustee is required by law to keep an eye on the ball. That's different than if you own the company and you decide to, on a whim, sell at a really low price, or you want to go do something that's not very profitable, but you're the owner and you're the only person that's accountable. So with the ESOP corporation, you have a diligent shareholder on board, and that's probably the main difference between most corporations and ESOP companies. They just operate the way most corporations should. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to share some statistics about ESOP companies and the benefit. And a lot of people wonder, does it really matter? Are employees really seeing a benefit? Well, we have a long history of, plenty of data to look at since, again, the 70s. So Rutgers, both of these studies are peer-reviewed empirical studies that I'm highlighting here. Rutgers found that there is significant higher, so low to moderate income workers have ESOP account median value of $165,000, and compared to the typical American household that only has $17,000 in retirement savings. So that's huge. That's a tenfold difference in retirement savings. The NCEO, it was funny, I heard Annie talk about the younger workers, the millennials, and the NCEO did a study of workers between 28 and 34 years old. And I would love to just provide them this study and say, being in an ESOP is associated with 92% higher median household net worth, 33% higher median income from wages, and 53% longer median job tenure. Those numbers are staggering and hard to ignore. So the retirement benefit is pretty far out there for these younger workers, but there is strong evidence that there is a huge benefit, both in immediate wages, job tenure, but also that long-term net worth. I also pulled up some recent data. I don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to highlight them. As a result of COVID, there was a survey done by the NCEO, the 2020 Executive Compensation Survey. It was just released a couple months ago. They found that ESOP companies have 52% of ESOP companies report flat or increasing revenues, and 22% report they're only down by up to 10% in revenue. So they're doing quite well, ESOP companies, in the downturn. 79% of these companies had an optimistic outlook for the next 12 months, and 55% plan to hire new employees as a way to deal with COVID. And one last bit, I saw just today a news report saying that Biden plans to increase the corporate tax to 28%, and also plans to increase investment taxes over $400,000 significantly. So if you're a business owner considering selling your business, now is a great time, especially considering that taxes are anticipated to increase significantly. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mitch. Really appreciate you going into all of that detail and those great stats. So we've gone into the weeds a bit, and now we're going to come back up again. Just a quick summary reminder, what we've covered: employee ownership is both a means and an end. It creates high employee engagement, stronger businesses, and smart succession. So next slide, we're going to look at what the process looks like. You can advance to the next slide. Great. So you are here in step one, exploration, learning about employee ownership, getting some basic information. A call or a few calls with employee ownership experts to get questions answered and dig into the specifics of your situation would be a great thing to do next. Step two would be the first formal assessment by having a feasibility study completed. Then if the feasibility is a thumbs up, you'd move into the roll up your sleeves part of the work. This is partnering, again, with an employee ownership expert to take, you don't have to worry about all the complications. They'll do that for you. This involves lawyers, CPAs, and others to structure the sale, set up the employee-owned entity, address any management changes if they're happening on the same timeline, and make sure that the right information sharing and training is being done with the right people. Then the sale is closed and your company is employee owned, hooray. But we know that the real magic of employee ownership happens, the great stories and the great data that you've heard, when there's an investment in an ownership culture. And this happens, most of that work happens, what we say, post-transaction. So when Project Equity works with companies, we commit to staying by your side for up to 2 years post-transaction to help make sure that the business and its owners continue to thrive after that transition. Next slide, just briefly on the feasibility process, which is the first formal step. It does a deep dive into the numbers. So we look at historical financials, and working with you, we develop future projections. So you're able to understand the amount of debt that the business could take on while not putting itself at risk of being over leveraged or having too much debt. This then becomes the ceiling of the sale price, because remember, the company takes out loans to finance the sale that are paid back out of future profits. During the feasibility, you'll also get a straw model of what the employee ownership looks like. So whether an ESOP, a worker co-op, an employee ownership trust, and we'll look at what future management scenarios are, and what the employment engagement model is and what it's desired to be. Next slide. So where to turn? You'd be in good hands with any of these organizations here, and there are many others who are great and can help you out to learn more. Some of the specific organizations depend on which form of employee ownership you think might be a right fit or you're interested in, and we're always happy to connect and help navigate the who and the what resources could be most beneficial. Last slide here is just a final note on financing. So next slide. If you are looking at an ESOP transaction, chances are that one of the major banks, or even a smaller bank, could help with the financing. Most of the major banks do have ESOP lending arms. But if you're not looking at an ESOP, worker co-ops or employee ownership trusts are a bit less well known by bankers. So often community development financial institutions can fill in the gap, and we can help connect with lenders that understand employee ownership transactions. Separately, at Project Equity, we have an initiative with a national community development financial institution called Shared Capital that can help provide loans for employee ownership transactions. We're also able to provide working capital loans in this very unique time period through a new fund we're launching that can help make sure that the costs of doing this, the legal fees, et cetera, of getting employee ownership set up aren't a barrier. So that's all we got. Thanks for being with us, and we're going to tackle some of the questions that have been coming in, and I will turn it over to Jim.
We do have quite a few questions. If we could have everybody come on back on screen. The first question from Sandeep was, can a franchise be converted to employee owned? And does that company have to be profitable to become employee owned?
Should I take this one?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Mitch?
Franchises are difficult because usually you have some requirements from the franchisor that for ownership. So it's not unheard of, but you should look at, the simple answer is just look at the agreement you have with your franchisor. Maybe there's a first right of refusal or a prohibition for transitioning ownership, but I'm aware of at least one. It was a car dealership that did that.
And while you're answering questions, Mitch, Hillary asked a question about, for an ESOP, are employees required to buy stock shares, or do you provide that as a benefit?
Right. There's no money required from the employees. This is money that's directly, it's a contribution to the ESOP from the company as a retirement benefit. The closest comparison would be the matching portion of your 401k. No money from your employees.
Okay. Nick asked the question, did I hear that companies with 10 or less employees, companies that have 10 or less employees, that this is not necessarily a good idea to go employee owned?
Yeah, I can tackle that one. Great question, Nick. So that's our general rule of thumb, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first is that in companies of that size, we're most often talking to a business owner when we're talking about an ownership succession. So that founder of the business, you got yourself and 9 employees or 8 or 7 or 6 employees. The owner of the business is talking about exiting. Now, when you pull out somebody from the business who is so central, it can be very hard to kind of backfill for that. So it doesn't mean it's impossible, but that's one of the big challenges. Another reason why it can be challenging for the smaller companies is you just have less systems and processes and structure set up. Oftentimes all that exists in the brain of the founder at that point in the business's growth. So those are a couple of reasons why we found that it can be much more challenging for companies that are fewer than 10 employees.
And then Adina asked, if I'm a company that's considering this, how does my company get evaluated?
Yeah, Mitch, do you want to tackle that from an ESOP perspective?
Sure. Revenue, I'm so sorry to be so technical with everyone. There are commonly accepted principles in valuation. Just revenue rule 5960 is what the IRS wants you to see. There are about 14 or 15 different factors. The idea is that it's a common yardstick for all privately held businesses, all private, not just ESOP companies or anything. And so businesses are being evaluated, privately held stock, the process is similar if you were to buy a house. Your real estate agent is going to pull comparables and look at standard things such as square footage size and lot size. So you're doing that with businesses as well. General rules of thumb might be a multiple of your EBITDA, so earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. Another method is the discounted cash flow analysis. CJ is well versed in these, and I'm sure their team would like to help out, take a look at those principles.
So we have probably time for one more question before I pass it back to CJ. Can I just ask Jeff, what advice would you give to owners that are on the phone today that are considering employee ownership?
Well, I think my advice is, really consider where you are in the development of your company, sort of the longevity. I think having a good succession plan is just so important. If you want the company to live beyond you and endure into the future, I think just starting the investigation early into what fits for your company. And if you're really focused on your people and having them be able to continue on with the company after you as an owner are no longer there, I think just really looking at that and sort of where your core values are and the culture of your company, and if those are all fits for what you're thinking for the future, then I think it's a great option. And yeah, there's a lot of metrics to just kind of measure as you consider it that are important, but for us, it's turned out great so far. We're only four years in, but it's been a really nice, way for us to go, and our people and employees seem very encouraged by it and positive.
Thank you for sharing, Jeff. Appreciate it. CJ, I'm going to give it back to you to close out our session today.
Thank you. There's so much wisdom here today, and I wanted to say a special thank you to Jeff and Annie for your time and your wisdom sharing today. It's so important for us to hear from the businesses that have made the transition and how it's going for you now. So thank you so much. And also Project Equity and Beister Institute are fantastic partners. Whether you want to start there or start with the SBDC, we all work closely together, so we'll get you where you need to go. Thank you. Expect an email coming in the next couple of days from Project Equity to follow up on this information. Thank you all for your time today, and thank you all, Allison, Annie, Mitch, and Jeff. We really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.